Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is your module on Hart Crane's poetry. I am Shormila Mojumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. Hart Crane is a modernist American poet who was born in 1899 and committed suicide in 1933. So he lived to be only 33. He had a rather problematic personal life because when he was about 17-18 years old, his parents separated, and he had a lifelong problem of alcoholism. He was a homosexual, but because of his upbringing, he always suffered from a kind of sense of guilt. So all these things contributed, probably contributed to the suicide, which ended his life at a very young age. Harold Hart Crane, popularly known as Hart Crane, was born at Garrettsville, Ohio. His parents had a tumultuous relationship and they divorced in April 1917. Crane dropped out of high school in his junior year and moved to New York City with the intention of joining Columbia University later. Through the early 1920s, small but well-acknowledged literary magazines began publishing his poetry. He earned respect among the avant-garde poets of his time when he published The White Buildings in 1926. This was his first volume of poetry. White Building contains many of Crane's most appreciated lyrics, including For the Marriage of Hostas and Helen and Voyages, a series of erotic poems written while Crane was romantically involved with Emil Offer, a Danish merchant marine. His ambition to synthesize America was expressed in The Bridge 1930. The Brooklyn Bridge is both the poem's central symbol and its poetic starting point. Crane left for Paris in early 1929. The Bridge received poor reviews, but Crane's sense of his own failure became crushing. Crane's life came to an end on the Gulf of Mexico, where he jumped off a ship he was sailing in. Now, as I was telling you, it was a troubled life and ended in a suicide. And Crane was, when he was writing Bridge, obviously he was inspired by Walt Whitman's poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And Brooklyn Bridge is a symbol, almost a symbol of the New York City itself. So it inspired Crane to write almost an epic of the American life, synthesizing various aspects of American life. And in his poetic endeavor, he was hugely inspired by T.S. Eliot and the Westland, and he felt that the Westland was very negative, full of death and destruction, and he tried to write something which will end in with some rays of hope, not as desperate or as distressful as the Westland. Crane's critical effort, like John Keats, is most distinct in his letters. He exchanged his views through letters with Alan Tate, Ivor Winters, Eugene O'Neill, and Graham Munson, and shared critical opinions with William Carlos Williams, E. Cummings, Sherwood Anderson, Kenneth Bach, Waldo Frank, Harriet Monroe, Marianne Moore, and Gertrude Stein. Crane's most significant critical views on poetry are expressed in his letters. So you see, Keats is very well known for his letters, and what can be considered to be the body of literary criticism that Keats ever wrote is actually contained in the letters that he wrote to his brother. For example, the one brother who sailed to America and other friends. So the large body of Keats's critical work is contained in his letter, and just like kids. Hart Crane also was a prolific letter writer, and most of his critical opinions are contained in his letters. Crane's letters to Munson, Tate, Winters and his patron Otto Hermann Kahn are particularly perceptive. His two most famous stylistic defenses emerged from correspondences through his letters. His Emersonian General Aim and Theories, 1925, was written to pursue Eugene O'Neill for writing a critical foreword to White Building, and the famous letter to Harriet Monroe, 1926, was part of an exchange for the publication of At Melville's Tomb. So he tried to persuade Eugene O'Neill to write a foreword to White Building, which was not really very successful. Eugene O'Neill didn't come up with a very favorable review of the book, and he also exchanged letters with Harriet Monroe to publish his poem At Melville's Tomb. Now, something that you must notice here, that there is some amount of intertextuality in his poems, and by intertextuality we simply mean, even if you don't go into the nitty-gritties of the theory, intertextuality is the interlinking of texts which is being written now and the texts which have been written earlier, and the poet's or the author's awareness of the existence of that text, and drawing material, comparison, inspiration, drawing material and comparison from the earlier text. Let's have a look at the works of Hart Crane. White Building, his first anthology, was published in 1926. Then came The Bridge, probably his best known poem, in 1930. The complete poems of Hart Crane was edited by Mark Seaman, and it was introduced by Harold Bloom in 2000. And there are other several editions of his poems and letters which were subsequently published, some immediately after his death, some long after his death. The Bridge. Here is a summary of the poem. The poem opens with the image of a seagull taking flight from its perch on the water. It flies past the chained shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge and on into the distance past the Statue of Liberty. So what is important is the image of the Brooklyn Bridge as chained and the seagull crossing over to the Statue of Liberty. Both these are symbolic. The seagull's disappearing flight reminds the speaker of the ghost-like flickers of movies. Movies are like a prophecy or the promise of some truth that's never told. He's not too keen on them. Now you see, when Hart Crane was writing this poem, cinemas were hogging the imagination of American public at large, and the way today cinema is looked at was probably not the way cinema was looked at that point of time. So cinema was a promise of it was some prophecy, it was some promise, and a promise of some truth that is never told. And so Crane was not really very sure how much he liked the cinema, and cinema came into this poem only as images. The poet admires the bridge from across the harbor, the way the sun shines on it, the way the bridge embodies potential energy, and the way it hangs free in the air. The poet now sets to describe how a mentally unstable person runs to the top of the bridge, stands for a moment, and then commits suicide by jumping off the bridge. It's almost foreshadows his own death, because he didn't jump from the bridge, but he actually jumped from a ship into the sea. And so you see, the bridge stands for him for many things. For example, it is symbolic bridge that connects two sides of the river, which means various aspects of various walks of American life. But at the same time, the bridge is also harbors a mentally unstable person who goes onto the top and finally jumps into the sea to commit suicide. So the bridge for him stands for so many things. The next picture presented is that of Wall Street. You know, Wall Street is the financial hub of America. Their stock exchange is located there. So Wall Street is a symbol of powerful America, which is financially powerful, which is militarily powerful, which has become mechanical and lost some of its human values. In a way, Wall Street represents the inhuman face of America. So the next picture in the poem is that of Wall Street, where light passes through the girders of high buildings onto the still street below. Clouds are sailing by and tall structures called derricks seem to be turning. The wind from the North Atlantic passes through the cables of the bridge. The bridge offers the promise of a reward which is as mysterious as the mysteries of heaven described in Jewish scriptures. The speaker expresses that the bridge watches as anonymous people pass by and functions like a forgiving element shadowing the anonymity of passers-by. Like a king, it pardons people. So you see the overwhelming presence of the bridge on the scene of New York City, because New York City gives shelter to huge number of American population, for a huge number of people. All of them are anonymous, and that the mass of anonymous people who pass the Brooklyn Bridge every day on their way to work, on their way back home, and this kind of gives you a picture of life in the New York City on an ordinary day. The bridge is described as a fusion of religious and artistic symbols to enhance its majestic presence. The speaker wonders how something as petty as human labor was able to hold together the choiring strings of the harp like Brooklyn Bridge. It's a refuge for extraordinary and marginal figures like prophets, pariahs, and lovers. So you see, the Brooklyn Bridge is a celebration of mundane physical, human physical labor. It is a show of engineering skill, which is also a kind of labor. And there is poetry in the bridge because he describes the chains of the bridge as choiring strings, as if they are producing some kind of music, as if the whole bridge is a stringed instrument and it's being played on and it is producing some kind of music. As night falls, the speaker watches the traffic lights to go over the bridge. The lights remind him of eternity, and the bridge seems to hold the sky up on its towers. It is so high that the speaker feels the stars are bedding thy path. So the bridge is associated with all the five sensory experiences of human beings. It is producing musical sound, it is producing celestial lights, it's connecting lives, it's giving hope, it's taking back hope, it sometimes harbors prophets, lovers, psychologically unstable persons. So it provides huge canopy over the city of New York. The speaker stands by the piers in Manhattan, looking at the shadow of the bridge in the light of the city. The lights in the windows of office buildings and apartments have been put out, signifying the end of day and approach of night. The shadow of the bridge is only clear at night. It's winter and another year is passing by, making the bridge grow in years and experience. The bridge here stands as a symbol of eternity. In this section of the poem, the bridge almost assumes a human personality, growing in age, growing in experience, and and it becomes a symbol of eternity, which no human being can be as eternal as the bridge. So and another thing is important, because the whole description in the poem is centered on the bridge, and the area around the bridge, Manhattan, is being mentioned, and so the places, everyday places where people go to work, where businesses are transacted, they are transformed in the fabric of this poem, and they stand for American life, various aspects of American life, its hopes, its despairs. In a way, his ambition to write an epic centering on the Brooklyn Bridge he is trying to realize in this poem. But like the river beneath it, the bridge never sleeps. Not only does it connect one side of the river with another, it seems to connect one side of America with another. It connects Americans. It functions as a symbol of unity and harmony. In the final two lines, the speaker asks the bridge to descend to the level of mere mortals and to help fill the space that God has left empty. So the mere concrete bridge to a symbol and back to be at par with humans on the ground. That is the movement that has been described in the poem. The seagull, which flies on to the top of the bridge and crosses over to the Statue of Liberty, is an ordinary bird, too insignificant to be used in the opening lines of a poem, but Crane uses a common bird as a symbol of freedom. Throughout the poem, he tries to reinvest our belief in the value of ordinary and anonymous things. I think this is something typically American, because America, if we go back to Whitman, probably this tradition started with Whitman, that ordinary things, ordinary people, ordinary incidents of everyday life, they have been given, they have been invested with symbolic significance, and that typically represents the poetics of modernist American poetry. Also, Crane is making an allusion to Walt Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, another classic poem about crossing from Brooklyn to Manhattan, written before the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed. So you have two views. One poem, it was written in the 19th century when the river has to be crossed in a ferry, and there is the other poem where the river, you can drive across the river on the bridge. So like Walt Whitman, Hart Crane found life in New York City to be a combination of excitement and fear, thrilling and thriving. So this is very modernist, because in modernist poetry, you will find that city occupies a very central position. If you compare this with the romantic poetry, you will find that in romantic poetry, city hardly figures, and in modernist poetry, it is the city and the city and the city which occupies a very central position. So the Brooklyn Bridge, on the one side of which is Brooklyn, on the other side of which is Manhattan, and that kind of symbolizes the entire New York City, is reflects one major preoccupation of modernist poetry. Crane represents a generation who had invested their faith in spirituality and not any institutionalized religion. His spirituality seems roughly in line with the twin 19th century currents of British Romanticism and American Transcendentalism. Yes, as I have tried to argue earlier, that American Transcendentalism is actually a late flowering of British Romanticism, and in America Transcendentalism was a reaction against Puritanism, because Puritanism was regimental in the sense that it spread its vice-like grip over every aspect of human existence, and you see the transcendentalists were particularly protesting against the church's agency to be the only method of communion, only means of communion between an individual and God, and they wanted to assume the agency themselves, by which I mean the individual should have the agency to communicate with God. And you know, the difference between religion and spirituality is that religion is a set of teaching, it can be a set of ritual practices which is dictated by a church or some such institution, but spirituality is something entirely different which can be independent of religion. Spirituality is the individual's awareness of his inner being, of his necessity to communicate with God, of his necessity to find out what is wrong and what is right, and all for himself, by himself, and may I say so, of himself. Into Brooklyn Bridge and the larger poem containing it, The Bridge, Crane makes an effort to establish a new mythology that does not contain mythical heroes but people and objects from ordinary life of the Americans. To Brooklyn Bridge primarily talks about the humdrum realities of New York City life and not America at large. Crane considered New York City a symbolic representation of America as a nation. It's the city of the future, full of exhilaration and menace, magnificent wealth and dismal poverty, where drudgery and fantasy coexist. Hart Crane sees New York as a place of great national potential. So you see how two strands of poetry meet here. One is transcendentalist, where the individual's need for spirituality is highlighted, and there is this mythopoeia, where no classical hero, no Agamemnon comes down, no classical hero is celebrated. It is the common man, it's the individual who is celebrated in these poems. And I will again refer to Walt Whitman, because it is Whitman who probably brought this trend to American poetry, and Hart Crane was trying to look at New York as a representative of America, which combines each and every aspect of American life. The Bridge, which contains To Brooklyn Bridge, is sometimes associated with T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Both poems offer a phenomenal reading of the 20th century life and depict the paranoia of modern existence. Both the poems criticize the hollowness of modern existence and offer a criticism of American capitalism and the endless desire for money making that the bourgeois class harbors. Crane does not sympathize with the peaceful citizen pampering their escapist traits at movies or with the executives of Wall Street splurging away to glory. Instead, his sympathy lies with the anonymous person about to jump off the bridge, with the down and out, with the lovers and the urban prophet. The next poem we are going to discuss is At Melville's Tomb. And you know, this is the poem At Melville's Tomb, about which he corresponded with Marianne Moore. And you know, I have very passingly referred to intertextuality, and in this poem you will find some, because the poet, as the title suggests, is at Melville's tomb, and what he is doing there? Is he paying his tribute to a progenitor, or is he criticizing him, or is he trying to draw some kind of inspiration from his work? So whichever he does, it's in a way intertextuality. The 16-line poem pays a tribute to the 19th century American novelist Herman Melville. In the custom of many poems written by young writers to address their forerunners, the poem accomplishes the dual purpose of praising the yesteryear writer and also suggests that he shares the worldview of the younger generation of writers. Crane imagines Melville meditating on one of Crane's preferred themes, the twin nature of the sea. The poem opens with the image of the novelist watching breakers roll onto a beach. Melville, being a sailor by profession, had complete knowledge and understanding of the sea. His famous novel Moby Dick, the one that Crane alludes to in his poem, is not primarily about the sea, but rather offers a study of fraternal and hierarchical relations between men at a whaling ship. So now it is clear why Crane was going back to Melville, because Melville was a sailor by profession, because he wrote Moby Dick, which is an epic, not only because of its various layers of significances, but it is also an epic description of life on the sea. Crane always had a fascination for sea, and that is why probably finally he wanted to end his life in the water of the sea. So what he is trying to do, as I was telling you, that he was trying to pay a tribute, he was trying to find inspiration, and he was kind of imagining that Melville feels some kind of empathy with him, because Melville was fascinated by the sea and so is he. The poem Melville's Tomb opens with an allusion to Melville's death as he died at sea. Crane imagines the dead Melville sitting at an elevated position watching through time. The word embassy signifies a Shakespearean locution for a message, which is bequeathed from sea to land, from washed up bones to on chapter 104 of Moby Dick, the word bequeath appears. So, what does this word bequeath mean? To give away. So, what is being given away? It is a kind of gift that the sea sends to the land. Crane, in a letter to the editor of poetry magazine Harriet Monroe, offered clues to interpret these lines. Monroe could not understand how ice could lift altars. In the second stanza, Crane talks about shipwrecks, cause death, and the remains of sailors and their belongings seem to tell a story that is heard by the mariner sitting atop through time. In the third stanza, Crane refers to circuit come and silent answer. The silence here is crucial too. One can merely hear sounds while underwater, especially at bottom of the sea. Therefore, wrecks pass without sound of bells, the same bells which Crane borrows from chapter 9 of Moby Dick, the continual tolling of a bell in a ship that is foundering or at sea in a fog. So, when does the bell toll? When it announces a death. And it so happens that in a ship, because the sailor's life is always at a danger, it seems the bell keeps on tolling, and this is an idea he borrowed from Melville's novel. Thus, the monody, the song of poets, coming as it does above the boundaries of Melville's tomb, high in the azure steeps is silent as well, to the sea-entombed Melville, to the mariner looking up from below, the water surface is the limit of his world. There are no further tides. The sea gets to retain the fabulous shadow of the floating mariner, the shadow signifying that the mariner is no longer a part of this world but has become a denizen of the sea. And this kind of, as I repeat now, it foreshadows Hart Crane's own death and his own destiny. Thus, Melville from his tomb bears witness to the profound feeling of timelessness that his vision of the sea invokes, and probably that is exactly what Hart Crane was trying to do when he invoked Melville, who died on the sea and whom he imagined to be sitting atop a ship, witnessing what is happening through ages, through decades, through a long period of time, probably time till eternity. In the poem At Melville's Tomb, Hart Crane, by willfully avoiding the present tense, places the reader into an epistemological predicament. Crane plays and challenges the idea of time and space, bringing together a character of the past and a situation involving the present. In the process of reviving Melville and his vision, for example, the poet alerts his readers of the present that had extended its existence in the past that Melville occupied just as the he of the poem who is living or whose significance lies in the past. The last stanza of the poem further problematizes the concept of time and human knowledge by stating that the mariner will not wake up, therefore suggesting the impossibility of the human race waking up to a futuristic epiphanies of the secrets of time and space. Human knowledge of time will always be limited, and only the sea will harbor secrets of eternity. Therefore, the shadow of the mariner is timeless and does not limit itself to any specified time frame. The next poem is My Grandmother's Love Letters. My Grandmother's Love Letters was composed in 1919 and appeared in Crane's 1926 collection, White Buildings. The poem consists of 6 stanzas, 3 of which are fairly traditional quatrains, and the other 3 deviate from that established pattern. Now, what is a quatrain? What is a quarter? It is the 1/4. So, it is 4. When you are talking about a quatrain, you are essentially talking about a stanza which has 4 lines. So, the first 3 stanzas have traditional 4 lines, and the next 3 stanzas he deviates from the conventional form and kind of experiments. The event that gave way to the composition of the poem is rather uncomplicated. The poet discovers his grandmother's letters tucked into a corner of the attic and contemplates reading them. In the process, Crane rediscovers his grandmother and wants to embark on an imaginary journey with her. The poem describes a rainy, starless night where faint light of memory is the only source of illumination. The poet now talks about human memory, his grandmother's old, faded, fragile and friable love letters that were hidden into the corner of the attic. So you see, this is a kind of memory poem. He revisits the love letters of his grandmother, and he is trying to fill in the gaps there by constructing a whole story, the cues for which were there in the grandmother's letters. These letters contain the private history of the poet's grandfather, of the delicacy with which one trade on the private space of Elizabeth, who before the discovery of these letters had just been referred to by the relationship she had shared with the poet. Therefore, Crane writes, over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. Crane seems to be striving to find a connection between him and his grandmother, a connection perhaps as thin as an invisible white hair, a connection that would help him to understand her private life better. Now you see, when you refer to somebody as grandmother, this is you refer to a definite relationship. It is consanguineous and it is societal. So the grandmother is either my mother's mother or my father's mother, but that the grandmother is an individual, a separate person. She had a private life of her own, which could have been very exclusive. All these things are always remain beyond our ken, because we always think of grandmothers as old ladies and who is very happy and satisfied and achieve the end of their life by becoming grandmothers. But through these letters, the poet seems to realize that the grandmothers are individuals, separate human beings. They had their private lives, and so when he is trying to establish a connection between him and his grandmother, it is not the consanguineous relationship, it is not the societal relationship, it is the relationship between two individuals who are separated by time, and that is why he wants to tread as softly as possible because the link is very tenuous. The connection trembles as he follows the absent presence of his grandmother in these letters. The poet is not only defining a lack of connection, but is realizing that he can never completely understand the weight of another person's interior life. This inability works both ways, for grandmother and grandson. The poet comes to terms with this lack of connection in the penultimate stanza, where he asks himself, "Are your fingers long enough to play old keys that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source?" The answer to many readers might be negative. The letters themselves are liable to melt as snow and, like memory, are incredibly fragile. So you see what I was talking, that this is a relationship between two individuals, not between a grandmother and a grandfather, a grandson. And you know, the grandson as an individual and the grandmother as an individual, lot of them are unsaid between them. They know a lot, they do not know a lot of things about each other, and when the grandson tries to reconstruct, he is using the image of playing a piano, and so he says that if do you have a long enough finger to play the old keys and produce the echoes? Probably not. Probably all these will result in silence, because memory is incredibly fragile, and the letters which contain the private life of the grandmother may melt like snow any moment. The next poem is Voyages I. Voyages I invokes the underlying deception and malevolence of a maternally guided and guarded world for children, where they are set free to play along the beach but are unaware of the limits they never should cross. The poem opens with a bright and gay description of children playing on the beach. Children are referred to as urchins because of the bright and striped swimsuits they wear. It's interesting to know that the children are playing above the waves and not in the water. In fact, the ruffles of the first stanza translates to the folds of the second stanza, folds invoking the image of curtains. Therefore, it can be interpreted that the waves offer an enclosure, a sort of boundary to protect the children from any exposure to hidden truths. These urchins, like children, have indulged themselves in child's play, but the apparently innocent games is not free from malice, as they contrive to compete for shells and do not deter from obstructing their opponents by scattering sand. The poet now draws our attention to the treble injections that the children indulge in. The children are by nature curious, and their curiosity is enhanced when things are censored from them. Thus, the waves with their shield-like function do invoke the curiosity of the children to explore what lies beneath the folds. At the end of the second stanza, the poet expresses his desire to articulate his knowledge of the dark forces of this world and to protect the innocence of these children with his experience. He urges the brilliant kids to frisk their dogs and fondle the seashells and stick. The sexual innuendo is clear with the use of words frisk and fondle, as if the poet is suggesting the inevitable exposure of the children to the world of adult experience. The idea is carried in the description of the shells and sticks, as the subsequent phrase insists, are bleached by time and the elements, like the fragments of Beckett wheat in the first stanza. They are tokens of death. The next poem is Chaplinesque. The title itself is almost self-explanatory, so you can very well imagine it's Charlie Chaplin who is being referred to in the title of the poem. The poem presents a voice to all those that are categorized as dissenters or social outcasts. They join their voices to state how to express their containment in making meek adjustments and are satisfied with random consolations. The self of Chaplinesque is a child of what is arbitrary, whose great hunger and need, as signified in his two ample pockets, find contentment in the wind. His wealth comprises abundant emptiness of his ragged pockets, which are always open to the world, ready to accept and obtain what the world offers with love. They still have the heart to protect a hungry kitten from the fury of the world and not walk past ignoring its miseries. The oscillation between the world and the self, between the world's inventiveness and the self's combative powers, is the essence of the poem. The self has to be resilient and assiduous to have its way in a world where its character is at constant contradiction with the established norms. The Chaplinesque self does not deter from facing the critiquing laughter of the society. They would embrace the doom of going against the idea as they are well aware of the consequence. They would face the dull squint of this world, the innocence and surprise, therefore rejecting what is being critiqued of them. Chaplinesque analyzes that the game of life, the clown's alteration of the world stage that enforces smirks, this Chaplinesque self is receptive to the unspoiled gratuity of the image of liberation beyond its need, its embarrassment and its hunger. He finds a spiritual fulfillment. He has heard the grail of laughter that the moon indulges in while looking down on an empty ash can, the burnt out remains of the world's fury. You can very easily hear the echo of one of Eliot's poems, Burnt Norton. Despite living in a world that critiques him and is later critiqued by the elements of nature, the Chaplinesque self can rise above these quandaries and experience a spiritual connection with the self, despite the dull squint and the smirks of the society amidst its own miseries and desires, finds emotional appeal to the helpless cries of a kitten. The Chaplinesque self can still love the world despite all the flaws this world has. And as you finish reading this poem, you know that how the probably the greatest comedian the world is being celebrated, because you know what appears as comedy is not always comedy, because what is hidden behind laughter and behind mimicry is a profound sorrow, helplessness, and that is exactly what Charlie Chaplin represented to the world. Chaplin had faced the dull squints of the world and was even ostracized from his society and from his country too. The poem is a remarkable dramatization of the position in modern society of those who are excluded from the establishment. The persona, the we of the poem epitomizes all outsiders, not only the poets and other artists, but also those who do not live according to the norms dictated by society. The poem salutes their undying spirit and their will to make their way into society that marginalizes them. So you see, we have come to the end of this module, and you remember Hart died rather young, so his poetic oeuvre is not huge, but you can see very well from the poems that have been discussed in this module that he was a tortured soul. He tried to negotiate with a world which he felt to be cold, dark, cruel, and still he tried to negotiate with them, and that is why probably the last poem that we discussed, he took refuge, he tried to draw strength from Charlie Chaplin, who was laughed at, and in exchange for the smirk he laughed back to the world, and thereby trying to retain his sanity, his sense of balance, and tried to negotiate with the world at large.